The laughter started before Mira Ashworth even reached the market square, and by the time she stepped past the flower stalls, half the town of Brindlewood was already staring at her. Elias Whitmore stood at the center of it, tall, well-dressed, and smiling in a way that made her stomach twist. He held up the hem of her dress between two fingers, as if it were something dirty, though it was only patched at the seam. "Look at this," he said loudly, turning to his friends. "A dress with more stitches than fabric. Tell me, Mira, did your mother sew this from old grain sacks?" The crowd laughed. Mira felt her face grow hot, but she did not look away. She had learned long ago that looking away only made people crueler. "It keeps me warm, Elias," she said calmly, "which is more than I can say for your manners." A few people chuckled at that, and Elias's smile faltered for a moment before he recovered it, sharper than before. "Careful," he said, stepping closer. "A girl like you should learn her place. Some of us were born to lead this town. Others were born to mend our clothes." Mira's hands tightened around the basket she carried, filled with thread and buttons from her mother's shop. She said nothing more, only walked past him, her back straight, her steps steady, while the laughter rang behind her like a bell she could not silence. She did not cry until she reached the narrow lane behind the shop, where no one could see her. Even then, she wiped her eyes quickly, because her mother was inside, coughing again, and Mira could not afford to let her worry. What Mira did not know, what no one in Brindlewood knew, was that within a single season, the boy who had mocked her in the square would be forced to call her his wife, and within a year, the very ground beneath Elias Whitmore's feet would shift so completely that he would spend the rest of his days wondering how he had ever dared to laugh. That evening, in a house far grander than anything on Mira's street, Elias returned to find his father waiting in the study, his face pale, and his hands trembling around a stack of papers. "Sit down, Elias," said Henry Whitmore. "What is it, father? You look as though the house is on fire." "Worse," Henry said. "We are ruined." Elias laughed, though the sound came out thin. "Ruined? Father, we own half the trade routes into the eastern towns. We have more warehouses than any family in Brindlewood." "We owe more than we own," Henry said quietly. "The shipments from the coast were lost twice this year. The creditors are no longer willing to wait. If we do not pay within 3 months, they will take the warehouses, the house, everything." Elias felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had spent his whole life being told he was the heir to something great. He had mocked others for having less, never once imagining he might soon have nothing at all. "Then we borrow more," he said. "We find another lender." "I already have," Henry said, and something in his voice made Elias go still. "What did you do?" Henry did not answer directly. Instead, he unfolded a paper and slid it across the desk. Elias read it twice before he understood. It was a marriage contract, and the name written beside his own was Mira Ashworth. "You cannot be serious," Elias said, standing so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "The seamstress's daughter? Father, I mocked her in the square this very morning. The whole town saw it." "Then the whole town will see you marry her too," Henry said, his voice hard now. "Her family holds an old claim, one that was owed to them generations ago. It is enough to save us, if her father agrees to release it as part of the marriage. I have already spoken with him. He is a proud man, but a desperate one. He will agree, for his daughter's sake." "I will not do it," Elias said. "I would rather lose everything." "Then lose everything," Henry said, standing to meet his son's eyes. "Lose the house you grew up in. Lose the name people still respect, for now. Lose your mother's health, because I promise you, she will not survive watching us fall into the street. Choose, Elias, your pride or your family." Elias stood in silence for a long moment. The fire in the hearth cracked, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice and went quiet. He thought of Mira's calm eyes in the square, the way she had not flinched even as he humiliated her. He thought of how strange it would be to stand beside her at an altar, bound forever to a girl he had spent years believing was beneath him. "Fine," he said at last, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "I will marry her, but do not expect me to treat this as anything more than a transaction." Henry exhaled, relief washing over his tired face. "That is all I ask." Across town, in the small house behind the shop, Mira's father, a quiet man named Edmund Ashworth, sat with his daughter, and explained what he had agreed to. Mira listened without interrupting, though her heart pounded harder with every word. "Marry him," she repeated slowly. "The same boy who mocked my dress in the square this morning." "I know how it sounds," Edmund said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But Mira, this contract could change everything for us. Your mother needs medicine we cannot afford. This house leaks more each winter. If this marriage brings enough security that we are never hungry again, is it truly so terrible?" Mira looked toward the small room where her mother lay resting, her breathing thin and uneven. She thought of the years she had spent watching her parents work themselves into exhaustion, stitching late into the night, going without so that she could eat. "I am not afraid of him," Mira said finally. "He is cruel, because he has never been tested. Let him marry me. I will not beg for his kindness, and I will not shrink from his temper. If this is what saves our family, then I accept it." Edmund reached for his daughter's hand, his eyes glistening. "You are stronger than I deserve as a daughter." "I had good teachers," Mira said softly, and for a moment, despite everything, she almost smiled. News of the coming marriage spread through Brindlewood faster than any fire could have. Within 2 days, everyone knew that Elias Whitmore, heir to one of the wealthiest families in town, was to marry Mira Ashworth, the seamstress's daughter he had humiliated in the square only days before. The whispers followed Mira everywhere she went. At the well, at the market, even at church, she could feel eyes on her, hear the murmurs behind raised hands. "Only an idiot would marry a pauper," he mocked. She overheard one woman say to another outside the bakery, not troubling to lower her voice. "Mark my words, that boy is only doing it because his family has fallen on hard times. There is no love in it, only debt." Mira did not correct her. The woman was, after all, telling the truth. Elias, for his part, avoided the square entirely in the days before the wedding, taking longer routes through the town to avoid the stares of people who had once respected him and now seemed to delight in his misfortune. His friend Charles Pemberton found him one afternoon sitting alone near the old stone bridge outside town, staring down at the water. "You look like a man walking to his own funeral," Charles said, sitting beside him. "That is close enough to how it feels," Elias muttered. "Come now, it cannot be so terrible. She seemed steady enough in the square, did not even cry when you humiliated her in front of half the town." Elias winced at the memory. "That does not comfort me, Charles. If anything, it unsettles me more. A girl who does not break when mocked is a girder who will not break easily as a wife either. I fear she will remind me of this every day we are married." "Then perhaps you should stop giving her reasons to," Charles said simply. Elias said nothing, though the words lingered with him longer than he wanted to admit. The night before the wedding, Mira sat by the window of her small room, looking out at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Her mother, weak but awake, called softly from the next room. "Mira, come sit with me." Mira went to her mother's bedside and took her thin hand. "I know this is not the wedding you dreamed of as a girl," her mother said. "No love, no soft words, only necessity. But listen to me, Mira. A marriage built on necessity can still become something more, if you let it. Do not go into that house as a girl waiting to be hurt. Go in as a woman who knows her own worth. No man, however wealthy, can take that from you unless you allow it." Mira leaned down and kissed her mother's forehead. "I will remember that." The next morning, the sky was clear and pale, the kind of morning that felt almost mocking in its gentleness, given what waited ahead. Mira dressed in a simple gown, plain, but clean, sewn by her own hands the week before. She wore no jewels, no elaborate lace, only a small blue ribbon her mother had tied into her hair years ago for luck. The chapel was quiet when she arrived, far quieter than a wedding should be. A handful of guests sat in the pews, mostly Whitmore family friends, who watched her with curious, judging eyes. Elias stood at the front, dressed finely, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere just past her shoulder, rather than on her face. The priest spoke the words of the ceremony, and Mira answered clearly when it was her turn, her voice steady, even as her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. Elias answered as well, his voice flat, almost mechanical, as though reciting lines from a script he wished he had never been given. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Elias did not smile. He did not reach for her hand with any warmth. He simply turned, offered his arm out of obligation rather than affection, and led her down the aisle past the murmuring guests. Outside the chapel, as they stepped into the carriage that would take them to the Whitmore estate, Mira caught a glimpse of the crowd gathered near the gates, whispering behind their hands. She heard the words again, carried faintly on the wind. Only an idiot would marry a pauper, he mocked. She did not know, in that moment, how wrong they all were, and how differently this story would end than anyone standing outside that chapel could possibly imagine. The carriage ride to the Whitmore estate was silent except for the sound of wheels grinding against the stone road. Elias sat across from Mira, staring out the window as though the passing fields were more interesting than the woman who now shared his name. Mira folded her hands in her lap and watched him quietly, refusing to be the one who broke the silence first. When they finally arrived, the estate rose before them, larger than anything Mira had ever lived in, with tall white columns and wide windows that caught the afternoon light. A row of servants stood outside to greet them, their faces polite but curious, clearly having heard the same rumors as the rest of the town. An older woman stepped forward, her apron crisp, her expression kind despite the tension in the air. "Welcome home, my lady," she said, offering a small curtsy. "I am Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper. If you need anything at all, please do not hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Mira said, offering a genuine smile, the first true warmth anyone had shown her since the wedding began. Elias walked past both of them without a word, heading straight into the house, leaving Mira to follow at her own pace. Mrs. Whitfield caught her eye and gave the smallest, most sympathetic shake of her head, as if to say she understood more than she could say aloud. That night, Elias made his position clear. "You will have your own chambers," he said, standing at the doorway of a modest room on the far side of the house, far from his own quarters. "You need not concern yourself with my affairs, and I will not concern myself with yours. This marriage exists because my father required it, nothing more." "I understand," Mira said evenly, though something in his tone, the coldness of it, cut deeper than she expected. "I did not marry you for affection either, Elias. I married you because my family needed help, just as yours did. We do not need to pretend otherwise." For a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or the faintest hint of respect, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." He left without another word, and Mira closed the door softly behind him, alone in a house full of strangers, bound to a man who had made his contempt for her painfully clear. She did not cry that night either. Instead, she unpacked her small bag of belongings, folded her mother's ribbon carefully into a drawer, and told herself the same thing she had told herself every difficult day of her life. "This is only the beginning. Whatever comes next, I will meet it standing." Outside her window, the moon rose high over the Whitmore estate, indifferent to the quiet storm building beneath its grand roof, a storm that would, before long, change everything Elias Whitmore believed about the world, and about the woman he had so carelessly dismissed. 3 weeks into the marriage, Mira had learned the rhythm of the Whitmore house better than anyone expected, and she had done it without a single word of instruction from her husband. She rose early, before most of the household stirred, and walked the long halls quietly, noticing things others overlooked. The kitchen accounts did not match the deliveries. 2 of the younger maids were being blamed for mistakes that were not theirs. The east wing had a leak in the roof that no one had reported because they feared upsetting Elias, who had grown increasingly short-tempered since the wedding. Mira fixed what she could without asking permission. She corrected the kitchen ledgers herself, sitting with the cook late one evening to sort out the confusion. She spoke gently to the maids, assuring them she did not blame them, and quietly informed Mrs. Whitfield of the true source of the missing supplies, a steward who had been skimming coin for months. "You did not need to involve yourself in any of this," Mrs. Whitfield said one morning, watching Mira mend a torn curtain in the sitting room with quick, practiced stitches. "You are the lady of this house now. Others should be doing this work for you." "I have spent my whole life doing this kind of work," Mira said, smiling faintly. "It would feel strange to stop, simply because my circumstances changed. Besides, I would rather understand this house than simply live inside it." Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment. "You are nothing like what the town says of you." "The town does not know me," Mira replied simply. "They only know what they were told to believe." Elias, meanwhile, spent his days avoiding his wife as much as the size of the house allowed. He took his meals early or late, timed carefully to miss her, and when their paths did cross in the halls, he offered only a curt nod before continuing on his way. He told himself this distance was necessary, a way of protecting whatever pride he had left, after being forced into a marriage the whole town still whispered about. But he could not ignore what was happening around him. The household staff, who had once approached him nervously with every small problem, now seemed calmer, steadier. Meals arrived on time and were better prepared than before. The accounts, which his father had grumbled over for months, suddenly balanced correctly. Even the tension between the younger maids and the older staff, which had simmered for years, seemed to have quietly resolved itself. It was Charles Pemberton who finally said what Elias had been refusing to acknowledge. "Your household runs better than it has in years," Charles said one afternoon, as the two of them walked the grounds near the stables. "I heard your steward was dismissed last week for theft. I also heard it was your wife who uncovered it." "She did nothing I could not have done myself, had I bothered to look," Elias said stiffly. "But you did not bother to look," Charles pointed out. "She did. That is the difference, is it not?" Elias said nothing, though the observation settled uncomfortably in his chest. That evening, for the first time since the wedding, Elias found himself lingering near the sitting room, where Mira sat mending a shirt by candlelight, her movements precise and unhurried. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him. "Is something wrong?" she asked, looking up. "No," he said quickly, though he did not leave. "I heard you dismissed a steward." "I did not dismiss him," Mira corrected calmly. "I simply showed Mrs. Whitfield the discrepancies in the ledgers. She and your father made the decision together." "Why did you not come to me first?" Mira set down her needle and met his eyes directly, something she rarely allowed herself to do, given how coldly he treated her. "Because you have made it very clear, Elias, that you wish for nothing to do with me, beyond what is required. I did not think you would welcome my involvement in your affairs, so I handled it quietly instead." Elias opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure what to say. There was no anger in her voice, only a plain honesty that left him with nothing to argue against. "Thank you," he said finally, the words awkward and unfamiliar on his tongue. "For handling it, I mean." Mira studied him for a moment, searching his face for mockery or condescension, but found none. "You are welcome," she said simply, and returned to her mending. He left the room without another word, but something in him had shifted slightly, a small crack in the wall he had built so carefully since their wedding day. The following week, Elias's mother, Margaret Whitmore, returned from an extended visit to her sister's estate in the north, unaware of the marriage that had taken place in her absence. She arrived at the house in a flurry of trunks and servants, and within minutes of stepping through the door, demanded to know why a stranger was sitting in her parlor mending linens like a common maid. "Mother, this is Mira," Elias said stiffly, standing beside his wife with visible discomfort. "My wife." Margaret's face went through several expressions in quick succession: shock, confusion, and finally something close to horror. "Your wife? Henry, what have you done?" Henry Whitmore, who had followed his wife into the room, sighed heavily. "Margaret, we needed to discuss the estate's difficulties. I did what was necessary to save this family." "By marrying our son to the seamstress's daughter?" Margaret's voice rose sharply. "Do you understand what people are saying? The entire town believes our family has fallen so far that our heir must marry beneath his station simply to survive." Mira remained silent through the exchange, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though her jaw tightened slightly, at being spoken of as though she were not present in the room. "Margaret," Henry said firmly, "without this marriage, we would have lost everything. The house, the warehouses, our name. Mira's family released a claim that saved us from ruin. I would think you would show her some gratitude, not scorn." Margaret's eyes moved to Mira for the first time, studying her carefully, taking in the plain but neatly stitched dress, the calm posture, the steady gaze that did not waver under scrutiny. "You may have saved our fortune," Margaret said coldly, "but do not expect me to welcome you as a daughter simply because my husband made a desperate bargain. I will treat you with the respect your position requires, nothing more." "That is more than fair, Lady Whitmore," Mira said quietly, her voice steady despite the sting of the words. "I ask for nothing, beyond what is fair. Something in her calm response seemed to unsettle Margaret more than open anger would have. She studied Mira a moment longer before turning sharply and leaving the room, her skirts snapping against the floor as she went. Later that night, Elias found Mira standing alone on the balcony outside her room, looking out over the estate grounds bathed in moonlight. "I am sorry for my mother's words," he said, surprising himself with the apology. Mira glanced at him, mildly surprised as well. "You do not owe me an apology for her behavior, Elias. I did not expect a warm welcome into this family. I never did." "Still," he said, leaning against the railing beside her, an unusual closeness for two people who had spent weeks avoiding each other. "It was unkind." Mira considered him for a long moment. "May I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you mock me that day in the square? Before any of this happened, before the marriage, before the debts were even known to you. What made you say those things?" Elias was quiet for a long time, staring out at the dark fields beyond the estate. "I do not have a good answer," he admitted finally. "I think, if I am honest, I mocked you because it was easy, because everyone expected it of me, and because tearing someone else down felt simpler than examining anything about myself." "That is a more honest answer than I expected," Mira said softly. "I am not proud of it," Elias continued. "Watching you these past weeks, seeing how you have handled this house, this family, my mother's cruelty tonight, without ever losing your composure, I find myself wondering how I ever believed you were beneath anyone." Mira said nothing for a moment, letting his words settle in the quiet night air between them. Words spoken carelessly still leave marks, Elias, even if they are later regretted. "I do not say this to wound you further, only so you understand why I have kept my distance as well." "I understand," he said quietly. "I do not expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that I see it now. The way I treated you, the way this town still treats you. It was wrong." For the first time since their wedding day, Mira allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "That is a beginning, at least." They stood together in silence after that. The tension between them softened slightly, though neither could have guessed how much more complicated their lives were about to become, or how quickly the quiet peace of that moment would be shattered by forces neither of them yet understood. A month after Margaret's return, the Whitmore estate hosted a gathering meant to reintroduce the family to Brindlewood society, a careful attempt to remind the town that despite the rumors of debt and desperation, the Whitmores remained a family of standing. Margaret insisted on the event, believing that a properly managed evening might quiet the whispers that had followed Elias since his wedding. Mira dressed carefully that evening, choosing a simple gown of deep blue that she had altered herself from an older dress left behind by one of Elias's cousins. She wore no jewels, only the small blue ribbon from her mother woven discreetly into her hair. When she descended the staircase, Elias, waiting at the bottom to greet arriving guests, found himself staring a moment longer than he intended. "You look well," he said, the words simple but sincere. "Thank you," Mira replied, smoothing the front of her gown. "I hope I do not embarrass your family tonight." "You will not," Elias said, and something in his tone made her believe him. The guests arrived in a steady stream, merchants and minor nobility from across the region, all curious to see the woman who had caused such scandal simply by becoming Elias Whitmore's wife. Mira greeted each of them with quiet grace, answering questions about her family's shop with calm honesty rather than shame, refusing to shrink from the curious and sometimes cruel glances directed her way. It was during the middle of the evening, as musicians played softly in the corner and guests mingled through the grand hall, that a commotion arose near the front entrance. A finely dressed man, clearly not from Brindlewood judging by the cut of his coat and the crest embroidered on his lapel, strode into the hall with an air of quiet authority that immediately drew every eye in the room. "Forgive the interruption," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "I am seeking a woman named Mira. I was told she resides at this estate." Elias stepped forward immediately, protective instinct rising unexpectedly within him. "I am her husband. May I ask who is asking for her?" The man studied Elias for a moment before responding. "My name is Grantley. I serve as an envoy for Duke Alaric Dunmoor. I have been searching for a woman matching this description for many months, following records that led me to this town, and finally to this house." A hush fell over the gathered guests. The name Dunmoor was known even in a town as distant as Brindlewood, one of the oldest and most powerful noble houses in the entire region, holding lands and influence far beyond anything the Whitmores could claim. Mira, who had been standing near the far window, speaking with Mrs. Whitfield, felt a strange coldness settle over her at the mention of the name. She had heard it before, whispered rarely and carefully by her mother in moments of quiet reflection, though she had never understood why the name seemed to carry such weight in her mother's memory. "I am Mira," she said, stepping forward, her voice steady despite the sudden attention of the entire room. Grantley turned to her, his expression shifting from formal duty to something closer to relief. "Might I ask your mother's name, my lady?" "Eleanor," Mira said carefully. "Eleanor Ashworth, though I believe that was not always her name." Grantley's composure broke for just a moment, a flicker of genuine emotion passing across his face. "Eleanor," he repeated softly. "Then it is true, we have found her at last." Elias stepped closer to his wife, confusion and concern mixing plainly across his features. "Found who? What is this about?" Grantley straightened, addressing the room as much as Mira herself. "For many years, the Duke has searched for his granddaughter, lost to circumstances that separated her from her family, before her birth was ever properly recorded among the noble houses. We have followed threads of information across a dozen towns, each leading nowhere, until records finally brought us here, to Brindlewood, and to this house." The room buzzed with murmured astonishment, guests turning to whisper to one another, their earlier scorn for Mira transforming rapidly into something closer to disbelief and curiosity. "You believe Mira is this granddaughter?" Elias asked, his voice tight. "I believe it strongly enough that I have traveled 3 weeks to confirm it," Grantley said. "The Duke himself will wish to see her, to determine the truth beyond doubt, but the resemblance to her mother, described to me in great detail by those who remembered Eleanor before she vanished from the noble records, is remarkable." Mira felt the room tilt slightly around her, the weight of every eye now fixed upon her with an intensity she had never before experienced, not even during the cruelest moments of her public humiliation months earlier. "My mother never spoke of nobility," Mira said quietly. "She raised me as the daughter of a shopkeeper. If there is truth to what you say, she kept it hidden even from me." "There would have been reasons for such secrecy," Grantley said gently. "Reasons I am not at liberty to explain fully tonight, though the Duke himself will wish to share them with you directly, should you agree to meet with him." Margaret Whitmore, who had been standing frozen near the refreshment table throughout the exchange, finally found her voice. "Are you suggesting that the girl we believe to be a common seamstress's daughter is, in truth, the granddaughter of Duke Dunmoor?" "I am suggesting exactly that, my lady," Grantley said. "And if the resemblance and the records prove accurate, she stands to inherit a position far beyond anything this town could offer her." The hall fell into stunned silence. Elias stared at his wife, as though seeing her for the first time, the calm, composed woman who had spent months managing his household with quiet competence, who had endured his mockery and his mother's scorn without complaint, who now stood at the center of a revelation that threatened to upend everything he believed about his own marriage. "I need time," Mira said finally, her voice steady, though her mind raced with questions she had never thought to ask her mother while she still could. "My mother passed only recently. I cannot simply accept such a claim without understanding the truth behind it." "Of course," Grantley said with a respectful bow. "The Duke does not wish to rush you. I have been instructed to remain in Brindlewood for as long as necessary, to answer what questions I can, and to escort you to the Dunmoor estate whenever you feel prepared to make that journey." As the guests slowly resumed their conversations, though now charged with a nervous energy that had not existed moments before, Elias pulled Mira gently aside into a quiet corner of the hall. "Did you know anything about this?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," Mira said honestly. "My mother spoke so rarely of her past. There were times she would grow quiet when certain topics arose, times she seemed to be guarding some memory too painful to share. I always assumed it was grief, over losing family to illness or hardship, not something like this." "If this is true," Elias said slowly, "you would be Duke Dunmoor's heir. You would hold more power and wealth than my family has ever possessed." Mira looked at him carefully, searching his face for the same contempt she had seen there, the day he mocked her in the square. Instead, she found only uncertainty, and something that looked almost like fear. "Does that frighten you?" she asked. "It should not matter to you what I feel," Elias said quietly. "But yes, if I am honest, it does frighten me. Not because of what you might gain, but because of everything I have done since our marriage began. If you rise to such a position, what reason would you have to remain tied to a man who mocked you before he ever knew your worth?" Mira did not answer immediately. She looked past him, out toward the window where the moon hung low over the estate grounds, thinking of her mother's quiet strength, of the years of hardship they had endured together, without ever knowing the truth of what had been left behind. "I do not know what will happen, Elias," she said finally, "but I will not make that decision out of anger, or out of a desire for revenge against this town, or your family. Whatever I choose, I will choose it with a clear mind, once I understand the truth." Grantley remained in Brindlewood for the following days, staying at the town's modest inn while Mira quietly gathered her thoughts, visiting her father to ask questions she had never thought to raise before. Questions about her mother's past, about the life Eleanor had lived before Brindlewood, before the shop, before the quiet, hard-working existence Mira had always believed was the whole of her family's story. Edmund Ashworth, when finally pressed, revealed what little he knew. Eleanor had come to him already carrying secrets she refused to share, fleeing something she called an impossible arrangement, a betrothal she could not accept, a family she believed would smother her freedom entirely. She had asked only for a quiet life, and Edmund, deeply in love with her even then, had given her exactly that, never questioning further, never pressing for answers she was unwilling to give. "She loved you fiercely, Mira," Edmund said, his eyes glistening with old grief. "Whatever grand life she left behind, she never once regretted choosing this one instead, choosing us instead. I believe that with everything I am." Mira held on to those words carefully as she prepared, in the days that followed, to finally meet the man who claimed to be her grandfather, uncertain of what truth awaited her, but determined to face it, exactly as her mother had taught her to face everything else in her life, with quiet strength and without fear. The journey to the Dunmoor estate took 4 days by carriage, winding through hills and forests that grew grander and wilder the farther they traveled from Brindlewood. Mira sat quietly for most of the journey, watching the changing landscape through the window, while Elias, who had insisted on accompanying her despite her initial protest, sat across from her with a stillness that betrayed his own nervousness. "You did not need to come," Mira said on the second evening, as they stopped at a roadside inn to rest the horses. "I know," Elias said simply, "but I wanted to." Mira studied him for a moment, uncertain what to make of the change in him since the night of the gathering. He had been quieter since Grantley's arrival, more thoughtful, less inclined to retreat into cold silence whenever she was near. "Why?" she asked. "Because whatever happens at that estate, whatever truce awaits you there, I do not want you to face it entirely alone," Elias said. "You have faced enough alone because of me." Mira did not respond immediately, though something in his words settled gently against the guarded walls she had built since their wedding day. On the 4th day, the carriage crested a final hill, and the Dunmoor estate came into view below them, vast beyond anything either of them had seen before, its grounds stretching for miles, its main house built of pale stone, with towers rising toward the sky, like something from an old story, rather than a place where people actually lived. Grantley, who had traveled ahead to prepare for their arrival, met them at the gates himself. "The Duke has been informed of your arrival," he said. "He wishes to see you immediately, my lady, if you are prepared." Mira smoothed her dress and took a steadying breath. "I am ready." They were led through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women in fine clothing, generations of Dunmoors staring down from gilded frames, until they reached a private study, where an elderly man sat near a window, his hair silver, his frame thin, but his eyes sharp and alert despite his evident age. Duke Alaric Dunmoor rose slowly as they entered, his gaze fixing on Mira with an intensity that made her feel, for a moment, as though he were looking through her rather than at her. "You have her eyes," he said softly, almost to himself. "Eleanor's eyes exactly." "You knew my mother," Mira said carefully. "I raised her," the Duke said, his voice thick with emotion he seemed to be fighting to control. "She was my son's daughter, born after his own untimely death, and I raised her as my own, hoping to give her the life he would have wanted for her. But she fled this house nearly 20 years ago, the night before she was to be married, into an alliance I had arranged for her protection. An alliance she believed was a cage rather than a shield. Why would she need protection? Mira asked. The Duke gestured for them to sit, and once they had, he began to explain, his voice heavy with old sorrow. This family has enemies, Mira, enemies who have long sought to weaken the Dunmoor line, to claim these lands and this influence for themselves. When my son died, leaving Eleanor as the last true heir of our direct line, those enemies saw an opportunity. I arranged her betrothal to a powerful ally, believing it would protect her from those who might otherwise seek to harm her or force a claim through less honorable means. But she did not want that protection, Mira said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. She wanted freedom, the Duke said, and so she vanished, and despite years of searching, I could never find a trace of her, until recently, when an old associate mentioned a woman in a distant town who bore a striking resemblance to a family he had once served. I sent Grantley to investigate, never truly believing we would find her, let alone find her daughter grown and married. Mira absorbed this in silence, thinking of her mother's quiet strength, her refusal to explain the shadows of her past, her insistence on a simple life despite whatever grandeur she had left behind. She never once regretted her choice, Mira said finally. My father told me as much. Whatever she left behind here, she found peace in the life she built instead. The Duke's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Then I am glad, at least, that her final years were happy ones, even if I could not be part of them. What happens now? Elias asked carefully, speaking for the first time since entering the study. The Duke turned his attention to him, studying him with the same sharp scrutiny he had given Mira moments before. That depends entirely on Mira. I am old, and I have no other heir. The enemies who once threatened this family have grown quieter over the years, though I do not believe they have disappeared entirely. If Mira agrees, I would name her my heir, formally and publicly, ensuring that when I am gone, this family's legacy passes into hands I trust completely. Mira felt the weight of the decision settle over her, far heavier than anything she had faced even during the darkest days of her marriage, or the cruelest moments of her public humiliation in Brindlewood. I need time to consider this, she said honestly. This is not a small thing you are asking of me. Take whatever time you need, the Duke said gently. I have waited nearly 20 years to find you. I can wait a little longer for your answer. That night, Mira and Elias were given rooms in the west wing of the estate, grand chambers far beyond anything either had known before. Mira stood at the window of her new room, looking out over the moonlit gardens below, her mind swirling with everything the Duke had shared. Elias found her there sometime later, having come to check on her rather than retreat immediately to his own quarters as he might once have done. What will you decide? He asked quietly. I do not know, Mira admitted. This is more than I ever imagined for myself. My whole life, I believed I was simply a shopkeeper's daughter, destined for a quiet, difficult existence. Now I am told I could inherit lands and influence beyond anything Brindlewood has ever seen. Whatever you decide, Elias said, I will support you. I know I have little right to say such things, given how I treated you before, but I mean it sincerely. Mira turned to look at him, searching his face in the moonlight. You have changed since that night in the square, Elias. I am not certain yet what to make of it. Neither am I, entirely, he admitted. But watching you, these past months, watching how you handled every hardship this marriage brought you with more grace than I deserved, it forced me to see myself clearly, for the first time in my life. I did not like what I saw. Mira said nothing for a long moment, simply studying him in the quiet darkness. Growth is not something I can dismiss easily, even from someone who once wounded me deeply. But actions matter more than words, Elias. Time will tell whether this change in you is lasting, or merely a reaction to circumstances beyond your control. That is fair, he said. I only hope I am given the chance to prove it. They stood together in silence after that, the vast Dunmoor estate stretching quietly around them, neither yet aware of the dangers still lurking beyond the estate's walls, dangers tied to old enemies who had not forgotten the Dunmoor line, and who would not welcome the sudden return of its rightful heir without a fight. 3 days after their arrival at the Dunmoor estate, Mira agreed to sit with the Duke's physician, and an old family record keeper named Oswald, a thin man with careful hands, and an even more careful memory, who had served the Dunmoor household since before Eleanor's birth. "There is a mark," Oswald explained gently, unrolling an old piece of parchment across the table, "that has appeared on every direct descendant of this line for 4 generations. A small mark, shaped like a crescent moon, just below the left shoulder. If you carry it, my lady, there will be no doubt remaining as to your identity." Mira, though uncertain about the strange tradition, allowed the physician to examine her privately, and returned a short while later with a quiet nod toward the Duke. "It is there," she confirmed, "exactly as described." The Duke closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed with an emotion he had clearly been holding back since her arrival. "Then there is no doubt left in my mind. You are my granddaughter, truly and completely." Oswald retrieved a small wooden box from a locked cabinet nearby, opening it carefully to reveal a delicate silver locket inside. "This belonged to your mother," he said, handing it gently to Mira. "She left it behind the night she fled. The Duke kept it safe all these years, hoping one day to return it to her, or to whoever might carry on her legacy." Mira opened the locket with trembling fingers, finding a small painted portrait inside, a young woman with familiar eyes and a gentle, knowing smile, so similar to the mother Mira had known that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. "She looks happy here," Mira said softly. "She was, before circumstances forced her into a life she did not choose," the Duke said. "I hope, in some small way, returning this to you offers a kind of peace, both for her memory and for your own understanding of where you come from." That evening, the Duke called a private meeting in his study, inviting only Mira, Elias, and his most trusted advisor, a stern but fair woman named Beatrice Holloway, who had served as the Duke's counsel for over a decade. "I wish to formally name Mira as my heir," the Duke announced. "This will need to be done publicly, before witnesses of standing, to ensure the claim cannot be challenged by those who might otherwise seek to dispute it." "Who would dispute it?" Elias asked. Beatrice answered before the Duke could. "There is a distant cousin, Julian Ashcombe, who has long positioned himself as a potential heir in the absence of any direct descendant. He has cultivated relationships among the regional council for years, believing himself the natural successor should the Duke pass without a named heir. He will not welcome this news." "Is he dangerous?" Mira asked. "He is ambitious," the Duke said carefully. "Whether that ambition extends to danger, I cannot say with certainty. But we would be foolish not to proceed with caution. I intend to hold a formal gathering within the month, inviting the regional council and other noble families to publicly declare you my heir, before witnesses too numerous and too respected for Julian to challenge quietly." Mira absorbed this news with a steady calm that seemed to surprise everyone in the room except perhaps Elias, who had grown accustomed to her composure over the months of their marriage. "I have one condition," Mira said finally. "Name it," the Duke said. "My family, in Brindlewood, my father, and the household staff, who have shown me kindness since my marriage. They must never be forgotten or dismissed, because of this new position. Whatever I inherit as the woman my mother raised me to be, not as someone who abandons the people who supported her through hardship." The Duke smiled, a warm, genuine expression that softened the years etched into his face. "Your mother would be proud to hear you say that. It is precisely the answer I hoped for." In the weeks that followed, Mira divided her time between learning the responsibilities that would soon fall to her, matters of land management, tenant relations, and the delicate politics of noble alliances, while also writing regularly to her father in Brindlewood, ensuring he knew he had not been forgotten, despite the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Elias, meanwhile, found himself in an unusual position, no longer the wealthy heir accustomed to easy respect, but a man watching his wife rise toward a station far above his own family's standing. He spent hours in the estate's library, studying the history of the Dunmoor family, partly out of genuine interest, and partly out of a growing desire to prove himself worthy of standing beside Mira as more than simply a husband bound by an old debt. One afternoon, Beatrice Holloway found him there, poring over old ledgers detailing the estate's trade agreements. "You seem determined to understand this family thoroughly," she observed. "I want to be useful," Elias admitted. "Not simply a name attached to hers, but someone who can genuinely support what she is building here." Beatrice studied him for a long moment. That is a wiser ambition than most men in your position would choose. Many would resent standing in a wife's shadow. You seem intent on standing beside her instead. I spent most of my life believing status was something owed to me simply by birth, Elias said quietly. Watching Mira earn every ounce of respect she now holds, through hardship, through patience, through genuine skill, it has taught me more about worth than anything my own upbringing ever did. Then, perhaps, Beatrice said, a faint smile touching her lips, you are not entirely the fool the rumors once painted you as. As the day of the formal gathering approached, tension grew steadily throughout the estate. Word had spread quickly, through noble circles, that Duke Dunmoor intended to name a long-lost heir, and speculation ran wild across the region, some believing it a clever political maneuver, others dismissing it as an old man's desperate attempt to secure his legacy before his passing. Julian Ashcombe, the distant cousin whose ambitions Beatrice had warned of, arrived at the estate 3 days before the gathering, uninvited but confident enough to demand an audience with the Duke regardless. I have heard troubling rumors, Julian said smoothly, seated across from the Duke in his study, his tone polite but his eyes calculating. A woman claiming Dunmoor blood, appearing suddenly after all these years. Surely you understand my concern, given how easily such claims might be fabricated by those seeking to profit from this family's wealth. The claim has been thoroughly verified, the Duke said evenly. Mira carries the family mark, confirmed by physicians and records keepers alike. There is no doubt remaining as to her identity. Marks can be replicated, Julian said carefully. Records can be misinterpreted, especially by those eager to see what they wish to see, after so many years of fruitless searching. Are you suggesting I have been deceived, Julian? The Duke asked, his voice hardening slightly. Julian offered a thin smile. I am suggesting only that such matters deserve careful scrutiny before being announced publicly. I would hate to see this family's legacy handed carelessly to someone who may not truly deserve it. The Duke studied his distant cousin for a long moment, understanding clearly the true motivation behind his sudden concern. The gathering will proceed as planned, Julian. If you wish to raise your concerns publicly, before witnesses, you are welcome to do so, but I warn you, baseless accusations against a woman who has done nothing but prove herself worthy will not be received kindly by this council. Julian's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, offering a shallow bow before taking his leave. As he passed through the estate's gardens on his way out, he paused near a quiet fountain, his expression darkening with calculation rather than defeat. He was not finished yet, and everyone at the Dunmoor estate, including Mira herself, would soon discover exactly how far Julian Ashcombe was willing to go to protect the legacy he had spent years believing would one day belong to him. 2 days before the formal gathering, Mira received an unexpected visitor while walking alone through the estate's eastern gardens, a habit she had developed over the past weeks, to clear her mind amid the growing pressure of her new circumstances. A young woman approached her cautiously, dressed in the simple clothing of a household servant, glancing over her shoulder as though fearful of being seen. "My lady," she said quietly, "forgive my boldness, but I felt I must speak with you before it is too late." "What is your name?" Mira asked gently, sensing the woman's distress. "Fiona, my lady. I serve in Julian Ashcombe's household when he visits this estate, though my true loyalty has always remained with the Dunmoor family. My own mother served for decades." "What is it you wish to tell me?" Fiona glanced around once more, before continuing, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard Master Ashcombe speaking with a hired associate 2 nights ago, discussing plans to disrupt the gathering, to cast doubt upon your identity before the council, using forged documents he has commissioned to suggest your claim is fraudulent." Mira felt a chill settle over her despite the warm afternoon sun. Forged documents, suggesting what, exactly? That the family mark can be replicated through certain rare methods, and that the physician who examined you was secretly bribed to confirm a false claim. He intends to present these documents publicly, hoping to sow enough doubt among the council members to delay or entirely prevent your naming as heir. "Why are you telling me this?" Mira asked carefully. "You risk a great deal by coming to me." Fiona's expression hardened with quiet determination. "Because my mother served this family faithfully her entire life, believing in its true values, fairness, honesty, protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Master Ashcombe cares only for the wealth and power this position offers. I would rather see the rightful heir take her place than watch a man like him claim what was never truly his to begin with. Mira thanked Fiona warmly, promising to protect her from any repercussions should Julian discover her disloyalty, and hurried immediately to inform the Duke and Beatrice of what she had learned. "This is precisely the kind of scheme I feared," Beatrice said grimly, once Mira had relayed Fiona's information. "Forged documents are difficult to disprove once presented publicly, especially before a council eager for any excuse to doubt an unfamiliar claimant." "What can we do?" Elias asked, having joined the meeting the moment he heard the urgency in Mira's voice. The Duke considered carefully before speaking. "We must expose the forgery before Julian has the chance to present it. If Fiona can identify the associate who created these documents, we may be able to trace the fraud back to its source, discrediting Julian entirely before he ever has the chance to speak before the council." "I can help with that," Elias said suddenly, drawing surprised glances from everyone present. "My family's trade dealings have brought me into contact with document authenticators across the region, men skilled in identifying forged seals and falsified handwriting. If Julian's associate is local, I may be able to identify him quickly." "You would do this?" Mira asked, studying her husband carefully. "You are my wife," Elias said simply. "Whatever comes next for you, I intend to stand beside you, not simply watch from a comfortable distance while others fight your battles." Over the following 2 days, Elias worked tirelessly alongside Beatrice and a discreet investigator hired through the Duke's connections, tracing the forged documents back to a minor scribe in a neighboring town, a man easily persuaded through modest payment to fabricate official-looking seals and signatures. With careful questioning and the promise of leniency in exchange for honesty, the scribe confirmed Julian's involvement in exchange for protection from the consequences of his own actions. The night before the gathering, Elias presented his findings to the Duke, Beatrice, and Mira, laying out clear evidence of Julian's scheme, signed confessions from the scribe, and documented proof of the payments Julian had made to secure the forgery. "This should be more than sufficient to discredit him entirely before the council," Beatrice said, reviewing the evidence with satisfaction. "Well done, Elias. I confess, I did not expect such thorough work from you. I have spent most of my life underestimated, and underestimating others in turn," Elias said quietly. "I am trying to correct that mistake, in whatever ways I am able." Mira watched him with an expression that had softened considerably over the past weeks. The careful distance she had maintained since their wedding, beginning to give way to something warmer, though she remained cautious about trusting the change too quickly. "Thank you, Elias," she said sincerely. "This means more to me than you may realize." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I only wish I had shown this same effort and care from the very beginning of our marriage, rather than only now, when circumstances forced me to confront my own shortcomings." The morning of the gathering arrived clear and bright, the Dunmoor estate bustling with activity, as servants prepared the grand hall for the arrival of the regional council, and dozens of noble families curious to witness the historic announcement. Mira dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep emerald green, provided by the Duke's own tailor, though she insisted on wearing her mother's silver locket alongside it, a quiet reminder of where she truly came from. "Are you ready?" Elias asked, finding her in the hallway outside the grand hall, dressed formally himself for the first time since their arrival at the estate. "As ready as I can be," Mira admitted. "Whatever happens today, I intend to face it honestly, without fear, exactly as my mother would have wanted." "Whatever happens," Elias said, "I will be standing beside you, not behind you, and not in your shadow." Mira looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the cold, dismissive man she had married months earlier, and finding instead someone entirely transformed by the months they had spent together, by hardship, by honesty, and by a growing respect neither of them had expected to develop. "Let us go," she said finally, and together they walked toward the grand hall, where Julian Ashcombe waited among the gathered nobility, entirely unaware that his carefully constructed scheme was about to collapse before the very council he had hoped to deceive. The grand hall of the Dunmoor estate had never held so many guests at once, or so it seemed to Mira as she entered, the vast space filled with council members in formal robes, noble families dressed in their finest attire, and a low hum of conversation that quieted noticeably the moment she and Elias stepped through the doors. Duke Dunmoor stood at the front of the hall, near a raised platform, draped in the deep blue and silver colors of his family crest. He greeted Mira with a warm smile as she approached, though his eyes carried the weight of the important moment ahead. "The council is seated," he said quietly. "Are you prepared?" "I am," Mira said, though her heart beat quickly beneath her composed exterior. Julian Ashcombe stood near the front of the gathered crowd, dressed impeccably, a confident smile fixed upon his face, as he watched Mira take her place beside the Duke. He believed, Mira understood, that his forged documents remained hidden, waiting to be revealed at precisely the right moment to cause maximum doubt and disruption. The Duke raised his hand, calling the hall to order. "Honored council members, esteemed guests, I have called you here today to formally declare my heir, a woman whose identity has been thoroughly verified through both physical evidence and the careful confirmation of our family's records keeper. I present to you my granddaughter, Mira Dunmoor, daughter of my late son, and rightful heir to this family's legacy." A murmur swept through the hall, though before it could settle, Julian stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Forgive my interruption, Your Grace, but such a significant claim surely deserves thorough scrutiny before being finalized. I have reason to believe this woman's identity may not be as certain as you suggest." The Duke's expression remained calm, though a flicker of anticipation crossed Beatrice's face as she stood nearby, evidence in hand. "What reason might that be, Julian?" the Duke asked evenly. "I have obtained documents," Julian said, producing a folded paper with practiced confidence, suggesting the family mark used to verify her claim can, in certain rare circumstances, be replicated artificially. "I fear this woman, however sympathetic her circumstances, may have been presented to you through deception, whether her own or that of others seeking to profit from your search for an heir." A wave of uncertain murmurs spread through the council members, several exchanging concerned glances. Mira felt her pulse quicken, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm, trusting the evidence Elias had gathered over the past 2 days. Before the Duke could respond, Elias stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "Might I address the council directly, Your Grace?" The Duke nodded, gesturing for him to proceed. "I would like to introduce a witness," Elias said, turning toward the entrance of the hall, where the discreet investigator he had hired led forward a nervous-looking man, dressed in simple clothing, the scribe responsible for Julian's forged documents. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the scribe was brought before the council. Julian's confident expression faltered slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "This man," Elias continued, "has confessed, in writing and before witnesses, to fabricating the very documents Julian Ashcombe now presents to this council. He was paid a significant sum, documented here in these receipts, to create false evidence suggesting the Dunmoor family mark could be replicated artificially, a claim with no basis in truth whatsoever." The scribe, prompted gently by the investigator, confirmed his confession before the entire assembly, his voice shaking but clear enough for all to hear. "Master Ashcombe approached me nearly a month ago, offering payment in exchange for documents designed to cast doubt on any claimant the Duke might present as his heir. I created the forgery exactly as instructed, believing only that I was completing a simple commission, not understanding the full extent of the deception, until it was explained to me by those investigating the matter." The hall erupted into astonished murmurs, dozens of eyes turning toward Julian, whose confident demeanor had entirely collapsed under the weight of the exposed scheme. "This is outrageous," Julian sputtered, though his protest carried little conviction. "This man's testimony proves nothing. He could easily be bribed to say whatever suits your purposes. The payment receipts bear your own seal, Julian," Beatrice said calmly, stepping forward with the documented evidence in hand. Evidence gathered independently, verified by authenticators, with no connection to this family whatsoever. I believe the council can draw its own conclusions." The council members conferred quietly among themselves for several tense minutes, before their leader, an elderly woman named Councilwoman Fairweather, rose to address the hall. "Given the evidence presented, this council finds Julian Ashcombe's claims entirely without merit, fabricated deliberately to disrupt a legitimate succession. We formally recognize Mira Dunmoor as the rightful heir to Duke Alaric Dunmoor's estate and legacy, her identity confirmed beyond reasonable doubt through proper verification, and unchallenged by any credible evidence to the contrary." The hall broke into applause, though Julian, his face pale with humiliation and defeat, turned quickly and strode from the hall without another word, his ambitions crumbling entirely before the very council he had hoped to manipulate. Mira stood at the center of the celebration, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from tense uncertainty to genuine acknowledgement, the weight of her mother's hidden past finally settling into a truth she could carry forward with pride rather than confusion. The Duke embraced her warmly, tears of genuine joy in his eyes. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become," he said softly. "Strong, honest, and entirely deserving of the legacy she once left behind." As the celebration continued around them, Mira found Elias standing quietly near the edge of the hall, watching her with an expression she had never seen from him before, something close to genuine admiration, rather than the cold indifference that had defined the earliest days of their marriage. "You did this," she said, approaching him. "Without your work, these past 2 days, Julian's scheme might have succeeded." "I only did what any husband should have done from the beginning," Elias said quietly, stood beside his wife, rather than apart from her. Mira studied him carefully, the months of hardship and slow transformation between them finally settling into something she had not expected to feel again after the cruelty of their beginning, a genuine warmth, tentative but real. "Thank you," she said softly. Neither of them could have known, in that celebratory moment, that Julian Ashcombe, humiliated and desperate, was already plotting one final, more dangerous attempt to reclaim what he believed should rightfully have been his. A week after the gathering, life at the Dunmoor estate had settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm. Mira spent her mornings with Beatrice, learning the details of land management and tenant agreements, while her afternoons were often devoted to letters, replies to well-wishers across the region, and careful correspondence with her father in Brindlewood, who wrote back with equal parts pride and disbelief at his daughter's extraordinary new circumstances. Julian Ashcombe had not been seen since his humiliating exit from the gathering, though Beatrice remained cautious, warning that a man so thoroughly embarrassed rarely accepted defeat quietly. "He has lost his public standing," Beatrice said one evening, as she and the Duke reviewed security arrangements for the estate's archive room, where the original family records were kept. But pride wounded, that deeply often turns desperate rather than resigned. Her caution proved justified only a few nights later, when one of the estate's night guards noticed a flicker of candlelight moving through the archive room long after the household had retired for the evening. Rather than raising immediate alarm, the guard quietly alerted Beatrice, who woke Elias and the Duke before approaching the room together, careful to avoid revealing their presence too soon. Through the partially open door, they observed a figure hunched over the very records that had confirmed Mira's identity, carefully removing pages from an old ledger and replacing them with folded papers of his own, clearly intending to alter the historical record itself to cast fresh doubt upon her claim. "Julian," the Duke said sharply, stepping into the room, his voice carrying an authority that startled the intruder into stillness. Julian froze, the stolen pages still clutched in his trembling hands, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced now with the desperate expression of a man who understood he had been caught in the act of a crime far more serious than mere scheming. "You dare defile the family archive itself," the Duke continued, his voice cold with genuine anger. "Attempting to alter historical records to serve your own ambition." "I only sought what should rightfully have been mine," Julian said, though his voice lacked any real conviction now. "Years of positioning myself as your natural successor, only to have it stripped away by a woman who appeared from nowhere, claiming a birthright she cannot possibly prove beyond a mark and a locket. The council has already ruled on this matter," Beatrice said firmly, stepping forward to secure the altered documents before Julian could destroy them. "Your continued attempts to undermine a legitimate succession only confirm the very deception the council already suspected of you." Elias, who had remained quiet until this point, finally spoke. "You should have accepted your defeat gracefully, Julian. Instead, you have only ensured your complete downfall." The estate guards, summoned quietly by Beatrice moments earlier, arrived to escort Julian from the archive room, his protests growing weaker with each step as he realized the full weight of what his actions that night would mean for whatever remained of his reputation and standing among the region's noble families. The following morning, the Duke called an emergency meeting with Councilwoman Fairweather and several other council members, presenting the evidence of Julian's attempted forgery within the family archive itself. The council's response was swift and severe, stripping Julian of any remaining noble privileges and formally banning him from ever pursuing a claim against the Dunmoor legacy again. This should conclude the matter entirely, Beatrice said with evident relief, once the council's ruling had been delivered. Julian's reputation is thoroughly destroyed now, and with the archive properly secured going forward, there should be no further opportunity for anyone to challenge Mira's rightful place. Mira, who had listened to the full account of the previous night's events with a mixture of alarm and quiet resolve, found herself reflecting on how far she had come since the cruel mockery of that morning in Brindlewood Square, months earlier, when she had been nothing more than a seamstress's daughter enduring public humiliation. "I never imagined my life would involve foiling forgery schemes within noble archives," she said to Elias later that day, a faint, tired smile touching her lips as they walked together through the estate's quiet gardens. "Nor did I imagine standing beside you as you did it," Elias replied, matching her small smile with one of his own. "Though I confess, watching you handle even this with such calm, it no longer surprises me the way it once might have. You have changed a great deal these past months," Mira observed, studying him carefully as they walked. "I find myself wondering which version of you is the truer one, the man who mocked me so carelessly in the square, or the man who has stood beside me through every difficulty since." Elias considered the question seriously before answering. "I believe they are both true, in a way. The man who mocked you was shaped by pride and comfort I never had to earn myself. The man standing here now has been shaped by watching you, by hardship, by finally understanding what genuine strength looks like. I would like to believe this version is the one I intend to remain, for the rest of whatever life we build together." Mira said nothing immediately, though something in his sincerity settled warmly within her, a feeling she had not expected to develop again after the coldness of their wedding day. "Time will tell," she said finally, though her tone carried less guardedness than it once had. "But I find myself, more and more, willing to give that time a genuine chance." As the sun set gently over the Dunmoor estate that evening, casting long golden light across the gardens where they walked, neither Mira nor Elias could have fully anticipated how completely their relationship, born from mockery and forced obligation, was about to transform into something neither of them had ever expected to find. Word of Julian Ashcombe's disgrace, and of Mira's confirmed place as Duke Dunmoor's rightful heir, spread quickly across the region, eventually reaching all the way back to Brindlewood, where the town that had once mocked Mira as a pauper now buzzed with an entirely different kind of gossip. Margaret Whitmore, who had traveled back to the family estate shortly after the gathering, received the news with a complicated mixture of relief and quiet embarrassment, recalling clearly the cold words she had once spoken to Mira in her own parlor, dismissing her as nothing more than an unfortunate necessity forced upon her son. When Elias and Mira finally returned to the Whitmore estate to settle matters regarding their future, Margaret approached her daughter-in-law with unusual hesitance, a stark contrast to the sharp confidence she had shown months earlier. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said quietly, finding Mira alone in the sitting room where she had once mended linens, as though she were nothing more than a servant. "I judged you unfairly, based entirely on circumstances rather than character. Watching what you have accomplished these past months, I understand now how mistaken I was." Mira studied her for a long moment, remembering the sting of Margaret's earlier words, but also remembering her mother's guidance about carrying herself with grace rather than bitterness. "Apology accepted, Lady Whitmore. I understand that fear of losing everything can make people cruel in ways they might not otherwise choose. I hold no lasting resentment toward you." Margaret's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion. "You are far more gracious than I deserve. I hope, in time, we might build something closer to genuine family, rather than merely tolerating one another out of necessity." "I would like that," Mira said sincerely, and for the first time since her wedding day, she felt the walls of the Whitmore household soften into something resembling true acceptance. Henry Whitmore, for his part, approached the situation with quiet gratitude, aware that his son's forced marriage, born entirely from desperate financial necessity, had somehow transformed into a connection that would benefit their family, far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first arranged the contract. "I know I forced this marriage upon you both without considering your feelings," Henry said to Elias one evening, as they reviewed the estate's now stable finances together. "I am relieved, more than I can properly express, that it has become something neither of you regrets." "I regretted it deeply, in the beginning," Elias admitted honestly. "I resented you for the arrangement, and I treated Mira with a coldness I am not proud of. But watching her these past months, learning what genuine strength and integrity look like, I have come to understand that this marriage, however it began, may be the single most fortunate thing to have ever happened to me." Meanwhile, in Brindlewood itself, the townspeople who had once whispered so cruelly about the seamstress's daughter now spoke of Mira with a mixture of awe and quiet shame, recalling their own unkind words with growing discomfort, as news of her true heritage and her calm handling of Julian's schemes reached their ears. Edmund Ashworth, visiting the Whitmore estate at his daughter's invitation, found himself treated with unexpected respect by townspeople and household staff alike, a stark contrast to the quiet dismissal he had grown accustomed to as a simple shopkeeper. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Edmund said, embracing Mira warmly during his visit, "not because of titles or inheritance, but because you have remained exactly the woman she raised you to be, honest, strong, and unwilling to let cruelty define how you treat others in return." "I could not have done any of this without the lessons she taught me," Mira said, her eyes glistening with grateful tears. "Every hardship we faced together prepared me for everything that came after." As the weeks passed, Elias made a conscious effort to demonstrate the sincerity of his transformation, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, consistent actions that Mira had come to value far more than empty words. He learned the names of every household staff member personally, thanking them directly for their service, rather than treating them as invisible extensions of the house itself. He accompanied Mira on her visits to Brindlewood, standing respectfully beside her rather than at a cold distance, and he began working closely alongside Beatrice and the Duke's advisors, determined to understand the responsibilities that would eventually fall to Mira, so that he might genuinely support her, rather than simply benefit from her rising status. "You have become someone I genuinely admire," Mira told him one quiet evening, as they sat together on the balcony of her chambers, watching the stars scatter across the darkening sky above the Whitmore estate. "I did not expect to say those words when we first married. Nor did I expect to earn them," Elias admitted. "But I intend to keep earning them, for as long as you will allow me the chance." Mira reached for his hand, a small but significant gesture, given the distance that had once defined their relationship. "I believe, Elias, that you have already earned far more than a chance. You have earned a genuine partnership, should you still wish for one." "There is nothing I wish for more," he said softly, and for the first time since the cruel mockery that had begun their story, the space between them felt entirely free of the coldness and resentment that had once defined it, replaced instead by something built patiently, honestly, and with genuine mutual respect. 6 months after the gathering that had confirmed her as Duke Dunmoor's rightful heir, Mira stood once more in the grand hall of the Dunmoor estate, though this time the occasion was entirely different from the tense confrontation that had once unfolded there. The Duke, his health gently declining with age, but his spirit as sharp and warm as ever, had called together the region's council and noble families once again, this time not to defend a contested claim, but to formally celebrate Mira's transition into her full responsibilities as the estate's future leader. "When I began searching for my granddaughter so many years ago," the Duke said, addressing the gathered crowd with evident pride, "I hoped only to find her alive and well. I never imagined I would find a woman of such extraordinary strength, integrity, and wisdom, qualities that will serve this family and its lands far better than I ever could alone in my remaining years." The hall erupted into warm applause, a stark contrast to the tense murmurs that had once accompanied Julian's failed accusations months earlier. Mira, standing beside the Duke, felt the weight of the moment settle over her, not as a burden, but as a genuine honor she had come to embrace fully. Elias stood nearby, watching with quiet pride as his wife accepted the formal responsibilities of her new position, responsibilities she had earned entirely through her own strength and character, rather than through any birthright alone. After the ceremony concluded, as guests mingled throughout the grand hall, enjoying the evening celebrations, Mira found a quiet moment alone with her father, who had traveled from Brindlewood specifically for the occasion. "I still remember the day you were mocked in that square," Edmund said softly, his eyes reflecting both old sorrow and present pride. "I feared for you then, feared the cruelty of a world that judged people so harshly, based on circumstances beyond their control." "That day feels like it happened to someone else entirely," Mira said, smiling gently at the memory that had once caused her such pain. "Though, I suppose, in a way, it was necessary. Without that humiliation, without the marriage that followed, I might never have discovered who I truly was, or what I was truly capable of becoming." "Do you regret any of it?" Edmund asked carefully. "The mockery, the forced marriage, the difficult months that followed?" Mira considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain of that public humiliation, certainly, but I do not regret where it led me. Elias has become a man I genuinely respect and care for, not because of who he once was, but because of who he chose to become, once given the chance. And I have discovered a strength within myself I might never have found, had my life continued along its original, quieter path." Later that evening, as the celebrations wound down, and guests began departing into the cool night air, Mira found Elias standing alone, near the estate's grand entrance, watching the last of the carriages disappear down the long drive toward the main road. "A long journey from that morning in the square," he said quietly, as she joined him. "A very long journey indeed," Mira agreed, "though I find myself grateful for every difficult step of it, strange as that may sound." "I am the one who should be grateful," Elias said, turning to face her fully. "You could have chosen bitterness after everything I put you through in those early days. You could have used your rise to power as an opportunity for revenge, or simply walked away entirely, once you no longer needed this marriage for survival. Instead, you chose patience, and grace, and eventually, something I never dared to hope for." "What is that?" Mira asked softly. "A genuine partnership," Elias said, "built not on debt, or obligation, or forced necessity, but on mutual respect, and, I hope, something closer to real affection." Mira reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his own, a gesture that would have seemed impossible during the cold, distant early months of their marriage. "I believe we have built exactly that, Elias. Not because either of us expected it when this all began, but because we both chose, again and again, to become better than the circumstances that first brought us together." Together, they walked back toward the grand hall, where the Duke waited to share one final toast with the family he had waited so long to find, and the son-in-law he had come to genuinely respect for the man he had grown into. In the years that followed, Brindlewood would tell many versions of the story, of the boy who mocked a pauper, only to find himself married to a duke's granddaughter, of the cruel words spoken in a market square that led, against every expectation, to genuine love and mutual respect. Some would remember it as a cautionary tale about judging others too quickly. Others would remember it simply as proof that true worth has little to do with circumstance and everything to do with character. But for Mira and Elias, standing together as equals within the grand halls that had once seemed impossibly distant from their humble beginnings, the story was simply their own, imperfect and hard-won, but genuinely and completely theirs. A life built patiently from the ashes of cruelty, into something neither of them had ever expected to find, together, and for good.